By the time the blue lights flooded the road, it was already too late. What sat in the back of that van wasn't just cargo. It was a line that had already been crossed, quietly, repeatedly, without anyone noticing. For months, maybe longer, something enormous had been moving through the country, hidden in plain sight. Not through violence. Not through street-level chaos. But through silence. Through routine. Through trust. On an ordinary afternoon, along a busy stretch of road in Liverpool, that silence cracked. A routine stop. A nervous glance. And a decision that would expose one of the largest ketamine seizures the UK had ever seen. Think about that for a second. No high-speed chase. No gunfire. Just a man behind the wheel, and a secret weighing nearly a ton. The question isn't what was found. The question is how it got there at all. How does someone operate at this scale without drawing attention? How do drugs worth millions move across roads, past cameras, past systems designed to stop them? And how close can someone get to power before it turns on them? Because this wasn't the story of a mastermind in the shadows. And it wasn't the story of a random mistake. This is the inside story of how a smuggling operation grew quietly, fed on fear and debt, and relied on one fragile thing to survive. Communication. And when that failed, everything collapsed. If stories like this matter to you, the truth behind the headlines, the moments before everything falls apart, subscribe now. Because silence is how these stories begin, and attention is how they end. Liverpool has always been a city that moves things. Goods. People. Money. For centuries, its docks have connected Britain to the world, containers stacked like building blocks, ships arriving and leaving without pause, paperwork flowing as constantly as the tide. That scale creates opportunity. And not just the legitimate kind. Where international trade thrives, smuggling has always followed. Not as chaos, but as business. Hidden inside schedules, manifests, and companies that look ordinary from the outside. Modern drug trafficking doesn't rely on dark alleys anymore. It relies on logistics. On freight routes that run every day. On vehicles that don't stand out. On intermediaries who blend into the background so completely, they're almost invisible. This is the environment where the operation took shape. And this is where Paul Farrelly existed, not as a headline name, not as a public figure, but as someone known in the right circles. Local. Accessible. Trusted. He wasn't a street dealer. He wasn't flashing wealth or demanding attention. His value came from coordination, from knowing who to speak to, when to move, and how to stay just far enough from the center to avoid the spotlight. Layers mattered. Distance mattered. Because in operations like this, exposure is failure. And as court documents would later reveal, what appeared to be ordinary business, vehicles on the road, materials in transit, work being done, was anything but. Behind familiar routes and everyday cargo, something far larger was moving. Quietly. Efficiently. And for a long time, completely out of control. Long before the seizure, before the courtrooms, before the headlines. This story began in a city where crime doesn't always look like crime. In parts of Liverpool, the line between legitimate work and illegal opportunity can feel thin. Cash moves fast. Questions aren't encouraged. And survival often comes before morality. For people on the edges, crime doesn't arrive as violence. It arrives as access. Handling money for someone else. Passing messages. Moving items that aren't yours and aren't meant to be seen. This is where Paul Farrelly's path began. Not with control, but with usefulness. He learned early that power didn't come from being visible. It came from being reliable. From knowing who needed something moved, and making sure it arrived. No street corners. No public disputes. Just logistics. The work rewarded distance. The further you were from the product, the safer you felt. The more layers between you and the street, the more insulated you became. And that insulation bred confidence. Small tasks became regular work. Regular work turned into trust. Trust opened doors to larger movements, longer routes, heavier loads. This wasn't a sudden leap. It was gradual. Almost unnoticeable. A favor here. A run there. Then coordination. Then responsibility. At some point, the scale changed. The margins grew. The stakes grew with them. Think about that for a second. The most dangerous people are often the ones you never see. Because ambition doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And by the time you realize how far you've gone, loyalty has replaced choice. What started as facilitation slowly hardened into obligation. An obligation, in this world, comes with consequences. By the time Farrelly reached the center of operations, stepping away was no longer simple. The money wasn't just incentive anymore. It was leverage. And the operation was no longer small enough to hide. By the time the operation reached its most active phase, it was no longer about moving drugs. It was about maintaining balance. Balance between speed and caution. Between profit and survival. Court findings later confirmed that vast quantities of ketamine were being transported in single movements, not broken down, not diluted. This was wholesale supply, designed to feed multiple markets at once. The routes chosen weren't secret back roads. They were the opposite. Major carriageways. Predictable patterns. Journeys that looked so ordinary they vanished into traffic. Investigators would later map how entry points fed into temporary storage sites, how those sites were rotated, and how distribution flowed outward in stages. Nothing stayed still for long. Stagnation meant detection. One subplot quietly unfolding was the role of legitimate materials. Kitchen worktops. Industrial sacks. Everyday construction goods, items that moved legally, daily, and without suspicion. The concealment wasn't crude. It was engineered. Another subplot sat in the phones. Communication was everything, and also the greatest liability. Encoded devices were issued not for conversation, but for instruction. Short messages. No names. No explanations. Everyone was expected to already know their role. But people are not machines. Drivers carried more than cargo. They carried anxiety. The knowledge that one mistake would be final. Some coped with silence. Others didn't. As volumes increased, so did dependency. More drivers were brought in. More handlers. More layers. Each layer added insulation and uncertainty. Trust became currency. Those trusted were rewarded with responsibility. Those questioned were quietly sidelined. But expansion creates noise. Late-night movements became more frequent. Timelines tightened. Margins for error shrank. And then there was the pressure beneath it all, debt. Drug debt doesn't wait. It accumulates interest in fear. For some involved, participation was no longer optional. Runs weren't opportunities. They were obligations. But the larger the operation became, the harder it was to control every moving part. Messages multiplied. Routes overlapped. The same vehicles began appearing too often. What once felt invisible started to feel exposed. The operation was still functioning, but it was no longer clean. And in organized crime, mess attracts attention. By this point, success had created its own danger. The system that once protected everyone was now stretched thin. And somewhere along those routes, among the traffic, the cargo, and the coded messages, the balance finally tipped. Long before the van was stopped, something had already drawn attention. Not a name. Not a face. A pattern. Across Merseyside and beyond, officers were seeing the same signals appear again and again, quantities that didn't match casual supply, movements that didn't fit street-level dealing, seizures that hinted at something much larger still untouched. This wasn't chaos. It was organized. That recognition triggered a coordinated response. Merseyside police working alongside the National Crime Agency, pooling intelligence that on its own looked incomplete, but together began to form a shape. Financial analysts followed money that didn't quite add up. Payments that moved without explanation. Costs absorbed where profit should have appeared. Small discrepancies that suggested someone else was underwriting the risk. At the same time, intelligence teams revisited earlier seizures. Not just what had been taken, but what hadn't. Routes that appeared once, then vanished. Vehicles that surfaced briefly, then disappeared from records. Phones became the next pressure point. Devices recovered in unrelated investigations were examined again, not for what they said, but for how they behaved. Message timing. Deletion patterns. Silences where conversation should have been. Redacted transcripts later shown in court would reveal how little was actually spoken. Short instructions. Coordinates instead of addresses. No context. No emotion. It suggested discipline. And discipline suggested leadership. Surveillance teams began watching movement instead of people. Vehicles before drivers. Routes before names. Timelines were built day by day, week by week. What time certain journeys happened. How long they lasted. How often they repeated. And slowly, a routine emerged. That was the break. The operation didn't reveal itself through violence or mistakes. It revealed itself through consistency. The same type of van. The same kinds of journeys. The same calm efficiency, repeated often enough to become visible. But even then, the picture wasn't complete. Officers knew drugs were moving. They knew the quantities were industrial. They knew the organization was disciplined. What they didn't know was who was truly in control. There was no obvious ringleader. No social media trail. No public display of wealth. Just movement. And silence. Surveillance stills captured vehicles at rest stops, industrial estates, roadside laybys. Nothing illegal in isolation. Everything suspicious in context. Pressure built quietly on both sides. Police waited, knowing that acting too early would expose nothing. Too late, and the operation would adapt again. Every decision became a calculation. Watch longer, or intervene now. Let it move, or stop it cold. Because in operations like this, the moment you act is the moment everything changes. And when the moment finally came, it didn't arrive with alarms. It arrived as routine. It happened in the middle of the day, on a road that never stops moving. The van was traveling along the East Lancashire Road when police signaled for it to pull over. Nothing dramatic. No pursuit. Just blue lights cutting through traffic and forcing a decision that couldn't be avoided. As officers approached, they noticed it immediately, the tension. Hands moving too quickly. Answers coming a second too late. A man trying to appear calm while his body betrayed him. The questions were routine. The behavior wasn't. When officers looked into the back of the van, they found large industrial sacks stacked carefully inside. At first glance, they could have been anything. But when the sacks were opened, the reality became clear. And it didn't end there. A stack of kitchen worktops sat against the interior wall. Ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of cargo designed not to attract attention. Until it was examined more closely. The worktops had been hollowed out. Hidden inside were even more sacks, tightly packed, deliberately concealed. By the time the search was complete, the scale was undeniable. Years of insulation collapsed in minutes. The van was seized. Phones were taken, devices that had carried coded messages and instructions. The driver was arrested at the roadside, the operation exposed not by force, but by scrutiny. Within hours, the story broke. Headlines followed. Images of the haul circulated nationwide. What had moved quietly for so long was suddenly impossible to ignore. The noise of the arrest faded quickly. What followed was quieter and far more final. Inside Liverpool Crown Court, the case was stripped of speculation and reduced to evidence. Prosecutors laid out what the seizure represented, not just in weight or value, but in impact. They described an operation far beyond personal use, one capable of feeding supply chains, damaging communities, and generating millions. The court was told that this was not the role of a casual courier. The quantity alone placed the offense at the highest level. The planning, concealment, and logistics pointed to trust, responsibility, and awareness. Defense arguments focused on pressure rather than power. Debt. Fear. Exploitation. A man caught inside a world he couldn't escape. But the evidence didn't disappear. The judge spoke to the organized nature of the offense, the sophistication of the concealment and the harm caused by drugs of this scale entering circulation. He made clear that while Farrelly was not described as the overall ringleader, he could not have been ignorant of what he was transporting. When the sentence was delivered, it reflected that balance. 5 years and 4 months in prison. A punishment tied directly to the seriousness of the crime. Assets linked to the offense were seized. Freedom was removed. And the life built around movement and silence came to a halt. The operation was over. The consequences were not. When the court doors closed, the city didn't stop moving. Routes adjusted. Spaces left behind were quietly filled. Because in organized crime, absence doesn't create a vacuum for long. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point, proof that routine, patience, and collaboration could expose operations built to remain unseen. Tactics evolved. Patterns once overlooked were watched more closely. But for Liverpool's criminal networks, the lesson was different. Distance no longer felt safe. layers no longer felt permanent. What remained was a quieter truth. This wasn't just about drugs. It was about distance, how far someone believed they were from consequence. And the question still lingers. When one organizer falls, does the system weaken? Or does it simply adapt, waiting for the next name to disappear into traffic? Do you believe justice was truly served, or did this case only scratch the surface of something much larger? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real crime stories built from court records, investigations, and what lies beneath the headlines, subscribe.